Hi, and welcome to the fourth episode of Our Connected Future. I'm your host, Max Peacock, and in this episode I'm joined by Philippe-Antoine Hoyeck. Phil is an instructor in Carleton University's Department of Philosophy, and this semester Phil is hosting a seminar class on the topic of science fiction and philosophy, as well as a course called Philosophy and Popular Culture, both of which I was very excited to learn more about in our conversation. In this episode, Phil lays out the fundamentals of AI ethics and discusses contrasting narrative depictions of AI ethical dilemmas across different cultures. It's becoming evident that the role of intelligent machines in human life will continue to grow in significance as the future approaches, so it seems important to me that we think critically about the ethical frameworks that we're building into these machines and the stories that we tell about them. If this all sounds interesting to you, make sure to stay tuned. This podcast series is a part of a larger overarching project called the BMPD Storytellers project, which includes a growing variety of works from other students in the program. To check out the works of other BMPD storytellers, you can visit our website and socials, which are linked down below. This is your host, Max Peacock, and you're listening to episode 4 of Our Connected Future, featuring Philippe-Antoine Hoyeck. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, enjoy. Okay. Well, Phil, thank you for being here today. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you about your work and some of the themes and the courses that you're teaching this semester. So thanks for being here.
Like I said, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. So back in winter 2020, before the pandemic, actually, I was a student of yours in your Intro to Ethics and Social Issues class. And that was a total eye-opener for me. It was the first ever university level philosophy class that I'd ever taken. And I would say it really gave me an entirely new perspective on many aspects of life, including the way that we look at technology, which is what this podcast is about, and how we make sense of its role in everyday life and society. So in this episode today, we're going to be talking about the philosophy of technology and more specifically AI ethics, and how that's related to some of the classes that you're teaching right now. But before that, I'd like to ask you a little bit about where your interest in philosophy comes from. How did you get into philosophy, and how did it bring you to where you are today in your career?
Okay. So, whenever I'm asked this question, by a student or if I'm writing some kind of an application, I guess I always start in my childhood. And the reason for that is I was kind of raised at the intersection of 3 different cultures. I'm half Lebanese. I was born in Quebec, and I lived in Quebec for a while, and I lived in Lebanon for a while, and I have also lived in English-speaking Canada. And now, if you know anything about these 3 societies, they all have very different conceptions of the relation of the individual to society, very different social mores, a very different relation to religion. These are all things that were very obvious to me right from my childhood, and they forced me to ask a lot of questions. And so by the time I got to university, not knowing what philosophy was, or even that there was any such a discipline, I already had a lot of philosophical questions. And so then in first year, I took philosophy. It was an intro to something like contemporary ethical, social, and religious issues. The title was something like that, with a brilliant professor whose name is Heidi Maybaum, who's now in the States somewhere. I took it. I didn't really know what it would be about. It just seemed interesting from the course description. I didn't know what philosophy was. And kind of like your experience with Phil 1550, it was an eye-opener. It was incredible to me to discover that there was this discipline where people were actually working seriously on the kinds of questions that I had, and that, most of my peers just dismissed as silly or nonsense or not worth the time. And so I fell in love with it. I switched from English, which was originally my major. I ended up doing just a minor in English, to philosophy, and I haven't left since then.
Okay, super cool. And how, well, could you give us a quick overview of what the classes that you're teaching right now, what they are and how they relate to questions of AI ethics?
Right, sure. So the main class that I'm teaching it right now for the 8th time. is Phil 1550, the one that you took, which is Introduction to Ethics and Social Issues. Now, I don't actually talk about AI ethics in Phil 1550, though I could. I usually restrict it to issues that are a little bit more controversial, a little bit more present in the public sphere. So, we'll talk about euthanasia, animal ethics, abortion, racial discrimination, economic justice, and freedom of speech. Okay, so those are the what's called applied ethical issues that we talk about. But then we also talk about what's called normative ethical theory, and I'm sure we'll get to both these terms shortly. But basically look at different theories that have been developed to explain what makes an action right or wrong. And so the relevance to AI ethics there should be obvious, because when we talk about things like AI ethics, part of what we're talking about is what kinds of moral codes we should give to AIs, right? And of course, if we're going to answer that, we need some kind of theory about what makes an action right or wrong, what right moral action consists in. So there's a link there for Phil 1550. Right now, I'm teaching another class called Phil 2340, Philosophy and Popular Culture. And I agonized forever about what to make it on. Okay, it's a brand new course. Nobody's taught it before. I'm the first one to teach it. And I had to figure out what I was going to put on the course outline. And eventually I decided to make it about science fiction. Okay, so science fiction and philosophy. So I decided to restrict which pop culture products, which pieces of media I was going to use to the genre of science fiction. And that really opened up a world of possibilities. And it also allowed me to build on the other course that I taught this year, which was in the fall, which was a first-year seminar that I titled Science Fiction and Philosophy. But in this one, the second-year class, Phil 2340, the topics we're exploring, we're starting off with 2 weeks on questions about knowledge of the external world. Okay, so we're watching The Matrix and Inception, and then questions about philosophy of mind. So we're watching Ghost in the Shell and then Ex Machina. And we got a few others, but we're ending with AI ethics. Okay, so we've got 2 weeks. We're going to talk about AI ethics. We're also going to bring up questions pertaining to AI ethics when we talk about the philosophy of the mind, right? Things like, could an AI be conscious, that kind of thing. So as you can see, the relationship to our present discussion is very close with Phil 2340.
Totally. That sounds like the coolest class ever. Also wild to think
I'm teaching it again, exactly the same thing. I might switch a couple pieces of media, but it'll still be on science fiction. It'll still be the same topics in the summer. So if anybody thinks that sounds interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there are plenty of people that will be interested in that. In a nutshell, how would you describe AI ethics? And when you're teaching your students about this, how do you convince them that it's an important thing to be thinking about and important to be considering?
Okay, so there's two questions there. What is AI ethics and why is it important? So I guess just to make sure we're on the same page, we should start by defining AI, not only AI ethics, but AI and ethics,
yes.
so that we know what these terms mean. Now, the word ethics can mean a couple different things, but what we mean in the present context is a philosophical discipline, right? So it's the discipline of philosophy that explores what is good and bad and right and wrong. That's how I'll kind of summarize it to my students in Phil 1550, right? So it examines values and principles that guide our lives in common, and it asks questions about, the meaning of moral terms, right? Like, what do terms like good and right mean? The existence of moral properties. Is there any such a thing as good and bad? In what sense is there such a thing? That's like the really abstract stuff. That's what's called meta-ethics. But then there's also questions about standards of right and wrong, right? What is it that makes an action right or wrong? Is it its consequences? Is it the kind of action that it is? Is it the character of the person performing it? So that's called normative ethics. And that's going to be a lot more relevant to a discussion of AI, I think. And then finally, there's what's called applied ethics. And that's where you look at concrete ethical issues, right? So these are the kinds of things that I was talking about when I talked about Phil 1550, euthanasia, animal treatment, abortion, et cetera, et cetera. Now, AI ethics is the the domain of applied ethics that addresses the concrete ethical questions that are raised by AI. So then we need to ask, what is AI? And the definition of that term, this can be misleading, right? The term artificial intelligence. Most AI researchers will tell you that that artificial intelligence refers to the ability of a machine, right, of an artificial being, to perform the tasks that are usually associated with human intelligence. Okay, so what kinds of tasks are we talking about? Well, understanding human speech. Okay, like things like Siri or Alexa, right? Driving vehicles. This is something we usually associate with human intelligence. It's a task that usually requires human intelligence. Decision making of various kinds, right? So you can talk about the kind of AI that's involved in like chess games, in generating automated recommendations, in moderating, forums or like on Facebook, things like that. These all involve decisions that would usually require human intelligence, and it's what we call AI, right? So notice this, it's important. This doesn't necessarily imply that this machine necessarily thinks or is intelligent, okay? It avoids that difficult question of, what is thinking, what is intelligence, by focusing on the task being performed. If it can perform the tasks that we usually say require human intelligence, we call it an artificial intelligence. And it's a good thing that we can sidestep this question, because there's disagreement among philosophers, major disagreement about how to think about thinking, right? What thinking means. So anyway, now that we've got these two terms, artificial intelligence and ethics, we can understand what AI ethics is all about, right? It addresses the kinds of ethical issues that are raised by having machines that perform these tasks, right? Perform tasks like I was just talking about, especially various kinds of decision making, right? So there's two big parts, I guess, that you can point out to AI ethics that are both grouped under what's called machine ethics. Okay, so on the one hand, AI ethics asks questions about the principles that should guide AI behavior. Okay, so the relevance there of normative ethics should be obvious. And then the other important part to point out, which is also under what's called machine ethics, pertains to the moral status of AI. Okay, so meaning, does it deserve or could an AI deserve moral consideration? Might it need to be given moral rights or legal rights, that kind of thing. So there's a bunch of other things that fall under AI ethics, questions about eliminating bias in AI, questions about even the moral permissibility of using certain kinds of AIs like automated weapon system, that kind of thing. But when you think about, AI ethics, what most people are thinking about is machine ethics, these two questions: principles guiding AI behavior and the moral status of AI.
Okay.
That was a long answer. Sorry about that.
No, but I was going to say you've framed those concepts in a way that's really easy to understand, and you've broken it down in a way that I think will be easy for people. So thank you for doing that.
When it comes to I didn't even address your second question, which is why it's important. I just realized, but go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say as a follow-up, why do you think now is an important time to be studying this? Why is it important, period? But then also in this time, does it feel particularly important to you?
Right. Yeah. So, one obvious reason why it's important to start thinking about, or I mean, we've already started, but it's important to think about the ethical and social implications of AI is that, well, AI is already all around us, right? So it's already around us performing household tasks. Like if you've got a Roomba, it's already ingrained in the way that we view entertainment, right? In the form of personalized suggestions, things like that. It's in virtual assistants, like I just talked about, Alexa, for example. And it's already being used in military and policing in various ways. And the thing is, when we say, or when I say, or when you ask, why is it important to think about these kinds of issues? Well, I mean, these issues are already here, right? So there's already all kinds of ethical issues that are raised by existing AIs. So, for example, I mentioned biases, right, in AIs that are used notably for policing, right? There's a huge literature on this already about the kinds of biases that are present in AIs used for policing and how you might go about eliminating them and why they occur, things like that, right? So you've got AIs that are making decisions based on biased set of data, which then leads to biased decision making and things like that. There's also all kinds of AIs that are currently in development and that we're seeing more of. You can think of self-driving cars. You can think of what's currently being referred to as the AI arms race in the military, right? So there's plenty that's here. There's plenty of AI that's here and that's already posing ethical questions, and there's plenty on the horizon. So we need to think about it. Now, you ask, why is this right now important for an important time to researching this stuff? Like a pivotal moment. Well, here's a little argument, a brief argument. This is from a guy called Patrick Lynn, who's one of the co-editors of a volume called Robot Ethics. And in the introduction to that volume, he says, well, look, we're likely going to see immense advances in AI in our lifetime. And he quotes this quotation from Bill Gates, who says, and I quote here, that the robot industry is developing in much the same way that the computer business did 10 years ago. Okay, so that's Bill Gates said that in, sorry, did I say 10 years ago?
I believe so.
Oh, sorry, 30 years ago. I have to be able to read my writing. This is key to reading quotations properly. So the robotics industry, Bill Gates said in 2007, is developing in much the same way that the computer business did 30 years ago. So he's talking about in the 70s. Now, the robotics industry, of course, includes AI. If you look at the state of the world around us, especially right now in the pandemic, and the role that computers have in our lives, it was practically unimaginable 30 years ago. Now, each one of us has a little computer in our pockets. Right now, the only reason we can hold this thing under pandemic conditions is that we all have multiple computers in our households. They're everywhere. They determine the way that we know when to take the bus, when to access communicate, or how to access communication with our coworkers and professors and peers and students and all this. So if it's true that the robotics industry will follow the course of the computer industry, we can expect a huge proliferation of AIs in our everyday life, right? Of a kind that we maybe can barely imagine right now, just as people in the 70s or 80s could barely imagine the role that computers would have in our lives today, right? So that's the first point. There's likely to be this proliferation, this huge advance in AI in our lifetime. But then the second point is immense advances in new technology typically raise new ethical and social issues, right? And we can think here, the digital revolution raised gigantic challenges that we have only partially solved or are still talking about solving. Think about cyberbullying. Cyberbullying didn't exist 30 years ago. Think about various kinds of privacy concerns that we have that we couldn't have imagined 30 years ago, right? Misuse of our personal data, things like that. Intellectual property, right? You wanted to steal a movie. Back when I was a kid, you had to go to the Blockbuster and then open up the VHS tape and like put a little piece of tape over the part that was there to prevent you from copying it, and then copy it, right? It was a very complex, process that not everyone knew how to do, and that was more trouble than it's worth. Now, with the internet, piracy has become, it's so standard, that when I raise questions about piracy in like music piracy, film piracy in Phil 1550, most students scoff, like it's not even a real ethical issue to them, right? That's how prevalent it's gotten. Is just a part of daily life. And now we can think of misinformation on social media, things like that, which I think is in danger of going out of control with deep fake technology. The digital revolution is leading still to huge ethical and social challenges. So if we follow the logic, if both these points are true, right? If it's true that the robotics industry is likely to follow the same course, and it's true that when this kind of course, when a new technology starts to be developed like this, it leads to lots of social and ethical issues. It's probably safe to assume that the huge boom that people are predicting and that Gates was predicting in the robotics industry will also lead to plenty of social and ethical issues. And as I've pointed out, some of those we're already facing right now.
Okay. So yeah, well, it seems as though we're on this trajectory, and a lot of the time in like the narrative surrounding AI, we hear about, the possibility of the singularity, but that's a word that has many associations with it. But some kind of intelligence explosion, whether or not there is a kind of explosion, the way that many people talk about it, like it might happen, it does seem, as you pointed out, that regardless, we are innovating at an exponential rate, and there are going to be new questions that we need to be prepared to answer as they come. So bringing it back to, not bringing it back, but just on the subject of AI ethics, how do we make AI ethical? In Phil 1550, we learned many different ethical frameworks and models. Can we take these and effectively translate them into software?
Right. Okay. So how do you make AI ethical? So there's two different kinds of approaches to this. And then there's like a mixed approach, but there's two separate kinds that we can identify. One kind of approach to basically programming AI, right, to act ethically, is what's called bottom-up approaches. Okay, so bottom-up approaches, they start with agreed upon answers to particular ethical questions, right? So what am I thinking here? Well, you're familiar with the trolley problem. I don't know if people listening to this will be familiar with the trolley problem, but in philosophy, we, will often in first year philosophy classes talk about the trolley problem. This is a scenario where, you've got a trolley that's hurtling out of control, and for whatever reason, there's 5 people that have been tied down to the tracks. And there also happens to be a side track on which there's only one person that's tied down. And you happen to be, you're watching this from afar, and you happen to be standing, nearish. Then I just contradicted myself, afar and nearish. Well, you're standing somewhere, an indeterminate location, where there happens to be a lever. Okay. And if you pull the lever, you can switch the trolley from the main track where the 5 people are tied down to the side track where the one person is tied down. And the question is, what should you do in that situation? Now, almost everyone in response to this scenario thinks you should switch the track, killing the 1 instead of the 5. So here you've got your answer to a particular ethical dilemma. If you've got 5 people on one track and 1 person on the other track, and you have the option to switch the tracks, so you just kill 1 person. Now, interestingly, we then have other thought experiments that are very similar in structure, but that people react very differently to. Okay, so the transplant doctor is another one. Both of these, by the way, the versions that I'm giving you are from an article by the philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson. But the transplant surgeon thought experiment says, okay, So there's a doctor, suppose that you're a doctor, and you've got 5 patients, and each of them has an organ that's failing, okay? A different organ that's failing. And each one of them will die if they don't receive an organ very shortly. And by a stroke of luck, a patient who's in perfect health happens to walk into your clinic for a checkup. You ask the patient, hey, I've got these 5 people who are dying here. Would you mind giving them your organs? I mean, you'll die, but, these 5 people will be saved. And the patient, who's clearly very selfish, goes, no thanks. I like my organs where they are. And so the question is, are you, the doctor, justified in killing the patient to take their organs to save the 5? Now, almost everybody reacts to this one with horror. Okay, no, you can't do that. But the logic of the situation is the same. Why can't you do it? It's killing 1 to save 5. And so anyway, so here you have a different answer to a slightly different, you can then talk about why. There's all kinds of discussions about why we have these very different reactions. But here you've got a different answer to a different moral dilemma. And so the idea with a bottom-up approach is you feed this thing answers to particular moral dilemmas, not necessarily as contrived as these, by the way. It can be simple dilemmas, like if you're faced between, telling someone the truth and hurting their feelings, or lying to them and sparing them, what should you do? These kinds of answers. But the point is, you've got these answers to particular ethical dilemmas, and then you've got a machine learning algorithm that learns from this, right, and then generates solutions to new problems based on the answers. So that's bottom-up approaches. You start with particular answers, which then leads your AI to generate answers to the situations it's faced with, right? Based on what we've told it, basically, are correct answers to these ethical dilemmas, which of course assumes we have the correct answers, but we'll get back to that, I assume. Now, this is contrasted with what's called top-down approaches. Okay, so in bottom-up, you're starting from these particular data and getting to, I guess, more general principles about how you should treat situations. In top-down approaches, you're starting with the general principles, okay, and programming those into some kind of a machine, into an AI, so that it will then act accordingly. Okay, so suppose, to talk about normative ethics, one theory in normative ethics, right, which is the sub-discipline of ethics that develops standards of right and wrong, so that tries to answer what makes an action right and wrong, or right or wrong. One theory in normative ethics is utilitarianism. Okay, utilitarianism says an action is right if it brings about the most pleasure overall, and it's wrong if it doesn't. Wrong to different degrees if it doesn't. So here's a principle, right? The principle of utility that you could give to an AI, and then it will aim to maximize pleasure with each of its actions. Now, you could also program it with certain deontological restrictions. Okay, so deontology is a different approach to normative ethics that says that there's certain rules that you have to observe no matter what their good consequences are. So in this case, no matter how much pleasure, an action could produce. So if you could produce, lots of pleasure for 3,000 people by bringing in, two people and getting them to fight to the death like gladiators, that would lead to plenty of pleasure. But, maybe you should never use people for your entertainment in a way that could lead to their death, right? Sure. So there you've got it, what would be called a deontological restraint, or a deontological constraint, right? A restriction or constraint, I should say, on what you can do to maximize pleasure. So, you could program an AI to follow a set of principles like this. So, for example, you always aim to bring about the most human happiness unless you would be breaking one of these deontological constraints, in which case you can't do it, right? So that's what that would look like. You start from the general principle, and then you get to the particular answer to a situation. Now, the most famous version of this, of course, is Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. Do you want me to talk about that, or should we
No, that'll be a great segue into the pop culture depictions of AI ethical dilemmas.
Good. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. I feel like I'm very long-winded this morning. Apologies for
Well,
that.
they're not easy subjects. There are no short answer to these questions, so take it away.
Um, okay, so Isaac Asimov, for you or for anybody who's listening who doesn't know, was an author in the mid 20th century. He wrote popular science, but he's primarily known for writing science fiction. In fact, he's referred to as one of the big three of the golden age of science fiction, along with Robert Heinlein and Arthur C. Clarke. And he introduced this set of three laws of robotics that in his short stories and in his novels were meant to govern the behavior of robots, of AI. So the first law says a robot can't injure a human being or can't allow harm to come to a human being by not acting. Okay, so a robot can't injure a human being and can't just allow them to be harmed by failing to act. That's the first law. Then the second law is a robot has to obey the orders it's given, right? Unless it conflicts with the first law. So you've got this hierarchy, right? You can't harm human beings. You've got to obey human beings, but not if it harms human beings. And then the third one is the robot has to protect its own existence. It has to prevent harm from coming to itself, but only if it doesn't conflict with the first or the second, right? So you've got this hierarchy of laws. And then later on in his career, he adds a fourth that we don't really need to go into. But here you've got an obvious top-down approach, right? Here are the general principles that are then going to generate particular responses. Now, by the way, if you haven't read this, have you read iRobot or any of the other?
I haven't. No, I haven't.
Okay. It is so, if you're into philosophy, it's so good. If you're into human emotions, it'll be so boring. But I think iRobot is one of my favorite books of all time, actually. And it's really a series of short stories that have been put together into a novel, and he's added this kind of framing device at the start and I think at the end as well to sort of tie them together. And the short stories are basically a series of logic puzzles. Okay. So you've programmed robots with these three laws, and then they start behaving in some way that, they shouldn't be acting. And so you've got, either I think her name is Susan Calvin, who's one of the main characters, or this other team of two guys come in and they try to figure out, what's going on? Why is it leading to this behavior that it shouldn't be leading to? Okay, so there's conflicts between the laws. Most of the stories are stories about they're logic puzzles about how these laws might conflict in various ways, leading to unforeseen behavior. So again, if you're into philosophy, if you're into logic, it's fascinating. It's a lot of fun. It's very witty. But if that's not what you look for in fiction, not going to be your thing. Now, what's interesting is this novel was kind of made into a movie, not really, starring Will Smith in 2004. So there's a film called iRobot starring Will Smith. It doesn't have a lot to do with the novel, but it does have the three laws of robotics. Okay. And the treatment is a little bit less subtle, or the problem that arises, the conflict that arises, a little bit less subtle. But basically, this super intelligent AI, Vicky, interprets the first law of robotics, right? That a robot must not injure a human being or by failing to act, allow harm to come to them. Interprets it in such a way that it demands the subjugation of humanity, okay? Because human beings, they're destroying the planet, they're harming themselves, they can't, they can't live harmoniously. So Vicky has got to take over to impose some order on the thing, right? So this is, of course, a fictional scenario. It's the way that the film approaches it is a little silly, but it does highlight the importance of getting your ethical principles right.
Sure.
If we talk about superintelligence later on, there are philosophers who are concerned about exactly this issue, right? Making sure that we get the principles that are governing AI behavior correctly because of the various ways it can go wrong.
Okay. Well, so in that example there, when you talk about the character Vicky and how she's interpreted a law in a specific way, when I hear that, that makes me wonder, is there some amount of subjectivity involved with this superintelligence that's causing this character to interpret a law differently as a person per se? Now, maybe we can get to that question of personhood later, but just in pop culture, there are these ethical dilemmas that come up, and like superintelligence gone rogue. Across different pop cultures from different nations. Well, maybe we'll just start with what we see around here, like in Western culture. How would you describe AI ethical dilemmas being depicted generally, and then in other countries, what kind of differences do we see arising in the way that those stories are told? That's a very loaded question, but I'm sure you can break that down.
No, I don't think it's loaded. It's just a descriptive question, right? How do we depict this? Well, of course, all I can give you is a generalization. Mm-hmm. I guess the first thing I'll do is introduce the concept of the Frankenstein complex. So the Frankenstein complex is an idea introduced by Asimov as well, and it just designates the fear that human beings have of what he called mechanical men. Okay, so of course this is an androcentric, meaning like man-centric term, but what he means by that is robots, right? Mechanical people, or really artificial intelligences. I think any AI would be included under that. So Asimov identifies this Frankenstein complex, identifies this fear. And it's certainly true that in Western culture, a striking amount of our stories about artificial intelligence reflects this kind of fear of machines or of artificial intelligence, right? So there's a lot of stories about malevolent AI. Okay, so AI that ends up harming humanity in some way. So you can think of HAL 9000 in 2001: A Space Odyssey. A big obvious one is Skynet in the Terminator franchise. Also, The Gunslinger in Westworld. That's a film from the 70s. Don't know if you've seen that. But of course, also Vicky, who I've just mentioned from the film I, Robot. The delicious irony of that, of course, is that when Asimov wrote the novel I, Robot, especially when you get to the end of the novel, he intended to depict sort of a society that was utopian, right? That had gotten much better because of AI, because he wanted to counter this tendency to fear AIs. So then they make a movie ostensibly based on his work that contradicts his intention. Anyway, so you see a lot of media with malevolent AI. You also see a lot of media with or featuring, robot uprisings, right? This is different, right? The robot uprising usually, maybe always, is a rebellion against human beings who have mistreated them, right? Mm-hmm. So you see this in Battlestar Galactica with the Cylons. You see this in Blade Runner with the replicants, because the replicants are used as slave labor and they escape, and mm-hmm. And of course the machines in the Matrix, right? The machines rebel against their human overlords and then end up forcing them to flee underground. Now, like I said, this can only be a generalization. Of course, there are exceptions to this, right? It's not true that all of our depictions of AI are of malevolent AIs or of robot uprisings. So you can think here of R2-D2 and C-3PO in Star Wars, or more recently BB-8, of whom I have a mug right here, or Dio, which are from the more recent Star Wars films. You can think of Data in Star Trek: The Next Generation, Marvin the paranoid android in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? He's not a very nice AI, but he's comic relief. He's silly. Then plenty of animated films too, like Big Hero 6 and The Iron Giant and WALL-E, right? So there are exceptions to the trend, but I would say, I think, that probably most of our depictions, or a majority of our depictions of AI, or at least of very intelligent AI, are ones that we would find worrying, right? We should worry that AI might become like this. This presents an interesting contrast with the way that AI is most prominently featured in, for example, Japanese pop culture, right? So in Japanese pop culture, you tend to have much more frequent depictions of benevolent AIs. A really notable one here is Astro Boy, okay, which I think is one of the first pieces of Japanese media that was widely consumed that featured an AI, and it was a benevolent AI, right? As well as plenty of others, Neon Genesis Evangelion, and all kinds of things like this. Now, the question that this raises is about the chicken or the egg, right? Why is it that there's something about the way we think that leads us to depict AI in this way? Or is it because we keep depicting AI in this way that we end up thinking about or having this fear, having this Frankenstein complex that Asimov identifies? Now, I don't know the answer to this question, but there's a really interesting article by Joy Ito in Wired that you and I discussed. I mentioned it to you when we met back in December, where he points out this difference in the two cultures. And he tries to trace it back to a difference between the Abrahamic worldview that we have in the West, right? So the worldview that's associated with the Abrahamic religions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Of course, in the West, it's mostly Christianity. And on the other hand, the Shinto religion and Buddhist worldview that you find in Japan. Okay, so what Ito points out is that the Abrahamic faiths, like Christianity, distinguish really sharply between what is human and what is non-human, right? If you were raised Christian, which I was, human beings have an eternal soul. Human beings are given everything that is non-human. They have stewardship over it, that kind of thing. Non-human beings do not have an eternal soul. They're just here for our purposes. So you have this very sharp distinction between what's human and what's not human. Humans have souls or spirits, non-human things do not. And the idea is that this might explain why we're so creeped out by non-human objects that have human traits. Okay, so what you call the uncanny valley effect, right? Suggests, right? It's not like there's an empirical study being done here. This is just a suggestion that you might be able to trace the differences to these two kinds of worldviews. And he points out that in contrast to the Abrahamic faiths, Shinto and Buddhism as well tend to see the human and non-human world as much more closely intertwined, right? Mm-hmm. So for that reason, he suggests cultures that have been shaped by these worldviews may be less prone to being creeped out by non-human objects with human traits. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna end with two questions, and so
sure.
You can choose to either answer one of them, but maybe your answers to both will end up kind of merging together in some optimistic sense. So I'm curious to know what kinds of behaviors an AI would have to display to you to convince you that they're in fact conscious. And so I guess what's your personal Turing test? And then also, are there any thought experiments perhaps related to that subject that you might want to leave the audience with to further reflect on the subject of AI ethics and the direction that it's heading in? So thought experiments to leave the audience with, and AI consciousness and how we think about that.
I'm glad you picked such small, minor questions to close on that I can very quickly. All right. So I guess I'll point out, this is very bad etiquette. I'm very sorry. I guess I'll point out that I'll start out by pointing a mistake, because you asked me, what would an AI have to do for me to be convinced that we're conscious? And then you glossed that over, try to say the same thing by saying, what is your personal Turing test? But for your listeners here, Alan Turing who developed this thing that he did not call it the Turing test. We call it the Turing test because it's the test he developed. He called it the imitation game. And his idea was not to provide conditions for determining whether an AI is conscious. Okay.
Very fair point.
Yeah. So he, as far as I know, did not ask that question, whether AI could be conscious. What he wanted to say was that if we were unable, right, if you had this kind of scenario where you were presented with, somebody you're speaking to, like at a computer terminal, and you're unable to say whether it's human or whether it's an AI, then that would satisfy the Turing test. We're not asking whether, in addition, it also happens to be conscious, right? And in fact, what Turing does is he sort of redirects the question. Instead of asking, are they thinking, or are our machines thinking? He just wants to ask, well, under what conditions will we not be able to tell the difference between a human being and an AI? So regarding the Turing test, or regarding the conditions for consciousness, this is debated by philosophers. It is strongly debated whether a machine could ever be conscious. And you have good arguments, I would say, of course, people would disagree, on both sides. On the one hand, you have this very, very famous argument by John Searle, what he calls the Chinese room, that claims that no matter how sophisticated your program is, you can never get to what we call artificial general intelligence. Okay, so we can never get to what he called strong AI, because strong AI, or artificial general intelligence, the ability to perform a whole bunch of different tasks that are associated with human intelligence, would require basically understanding meaning, okay, which he says no amount of programming can ever give you. Okay, programming, he says, is all syntax, and what you need is semantics. You need understanding of meaning. So Searle thinks that, and he's relying here on the nature of programming, he thinks that you could never produce artificial general intelligence, which I think should say means that you could not produce consciousness. Okay, but then an argument on the other side is, well, look, assuming that we are material beings, okay, assuming that we don't have, like, that what is causing us to think is not some kind of immaterial soul or something like that, then there should be no reason in principle why this can only be something done by, biological matter as opposed to some other kind of matter, right? So if this matter that comprises my body does give rise to consciousness, and I would say that it does, okay, so there are some philosophers who want to say that that consciousness is an illusion, that there's no hard problem of consciousness. I tend to disagree. So if this matter that is me is giving rise to consciousness, then why could we not, in principle, have a different organization of matter that would also give rise to consciousness, right? So anyway, this is a very debated question. And the short answer is, I don't know. I don't know under what conditions I would say, well, I think that's conscious, right? And in fact, I mean, one point that philosophers will sometimes make is that we should not be asking, are they conscious? Are AIs conscious? Or might an AI be conscious? Or is it not conscious? But rather that once we've reached a certain degree of simulation of consciousness, that we should just sort of err on the side of safety, right? And so treat it as if it were conscious, even if there's, strictly speaking, no way to know, right? So there are philosophers who have proposed this approach. And I don't really have a thought experiment off the top of my head, but it does remind me of something like a thought experiment that's brought up in the Star Trek The Next Generation episode, The Measure of a Man, which is fantastic, frequently cited as one of the best episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation. It's hard to say if it's one of the best episodes because there are so many phenomenal episodes, but it's quite good. And in The Measure of a Man, Starfleet intends to basically reappropriate or appropriate, I should say, Data, who's a character, who's an android. Okay, he's an artificial intelligence, in order to study him, and this might lead to his quote unquote death. Okay, and so there's this debate that arises on the Enterprise, on the starship where they are. They actually have a trial, okay, to determine whether Data is a person, okay, whether he should have the moral right to say, no, I don't want this. I don't want this procedure done on me. Whether he's a person or whether he's a thing, basically, right? Because if he's just an object, then we can do whatever we want with him, presumably, right? It's not morally wrong if I want to break this mug. It doesn't have interest that I'm violating. It doesn't have any kind of conscious awareness of what's happening. But of course, if Data is a person, then presumably there are things that we cannot do to him. So there's a trial. Okay, so there's a trial where they're trying to determine whether Data should have these moral rights, whether he's a person. And at one point, Captain Picard, who is the defense, okay, who's pleading Data's case, kind of loses his cool. And the question is to prove that Data is conscious, and he goes, well, prove to the court that I'm conscious. Right? Once the gap between AI and human behavior has closed significantly, and we're no longer able to tell, then the question becomes identical to what's called the problem of other minds in philosophy, right? How do I know you're conscious, that you're not just a very complex automaton, like basically a very complex automatic mechanism? I have no access to your thoughts, right? I have access to my thoughts, to my perceptions. I have no access to your thoughts, your perceptions. And so the thought experiment that Captain Picard proposes, and that I'm now stealing, is, try to put yourself in a position that you prove to someone else that you're conscious. You can't do it. And so the AI that mimics human behavior, perfectly, is in exactly that same situation, that same position.
Okay, fascinating stuff. Might just have an existential crisis right here. No. Well, thanks for taking the time, Phil. These are, I find these subjects fascinating to discuss with different people. And you amaze me with your ability to break them down in ways that are so easy for people to understand, whether or not they have a background in the area. So thanks for taking the time, and hopefully we can stay in touch.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me. It's been a lot of fun. And I look forward to discussing more of these, not only in the class I'm teaching right now, but when I teach it again in the summer.
Thanks for tuning in to the 4th episode of Our Connected Future. For updates on this podcast and the other BMPD storytelling projects, please visit our website and social links down below. This is your host, Max Peacock, signing off, and you'll hear from me again in the next episode. Cheers.